Bongani Kupe, who joins us now virtually. Very good evening to you, Mr. Kupe. Thank you so much for joining us and a warm welcome to the late edition.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Indeed, it's an absolute pleasure, sir. Now, the national dialogue was meant to foster unity and consensus building. So what's your immediate reaction to the DA's decision to withdraw from this initiative?
Yeah, I think there's a confusion. National dialogue, it's not a government initiative. It's a civil society initiative. And therefore, I think the confusion is that in the national dialogue, one of the structures is called the Interministerial Committee, which is appointed by the president, by the head of state. But the national dialogue is not a political party owned, is not government owned, is not any, it's a citizen-led initiative. So every South African is invited to participate in the national dialogue. And the national dialogue precisely wants to solve the issues that South Africa is facing. So anyone who has interest in deciding the future South Africa we want should participate in the national dialogue. But it's not led by government, and therefore any political announcement has nothing to do with the national dialogue. It might have to do with GNU, but not with the national dialogue.
All right, as we've just alluded to the fact that, this is for the citizenry and not particularly any political party. In fact, we've just heard in the insert that we played right now, just a few minutes ago, the ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula says that this dialogue is not for the exclusive preserve of the DA, but for South Africans. But how does the withdrawal of such a significant political party affect the legitimacy, the inclusivity, and the overall outcomes of the national dialogue?
The role of the national dialogue is to invite everyone. Even DA is going to be invited. All political parties, all civil society institutions are going to be invited into the national dialogue. So for us, for the national dialogue, it's not about who is participating and what do they believe in and things like that. It's about South Africans coming together to solve South African problems. And anyone who is interested in participating in doing so, in deciding on the South Africa we want, will have to participate and will have no other option but to make sure that each South African has got an equal opportunity to participate in this dialogue.
Mr. Kupe, I suppose South Africans will now hold you to this, to see whether this dialogue was indeed representative. And having said that, what mechanisms then are in place to ensure that this dialogue continues to be representative if stakeholders withdraw?
The 15th of August is a preparatory convention. It is not a national dialogue. In that, we're trying to basically identify all civil society, both organized and unorganized structures, so that we know how we are going to go to the local level and make sure that people participate. It is not a once-off event that takes place at each locality. As a result, interfaith organizations, sports bodies, arts and culture, political parties, civil society organizations and things like that, everyone in that first national, we will have to define how we go to basically engage. So it is not a territory for any other organization, political party, or exclusive civil society to participate. Everyone is allowed to participate. And therefore, and hence, by definition, it's a national dialogue.
Right.
So if you exclude anyone as part of this process, then it stops being the national dialogue.
All right. And some critics argue that this dialogue is being used to sort of rubber stamp predetermined outcomes rather than to genuinely engage the divergent views. So how do you respond to such perceptions?
The national dialogue, the reason for national dialogue is because it is important that South Africans begin to chart the way in which they want this country to be. Mm-hmm. And there are no holy grounds. Everything in this dialogue, we will talk about the economy, we'll talk about leadership, everyone is allowed to basically express what is needed in order for a new South Africa, for the South Africa we want. And therefore, it cannot be exclusive, because once you close this process, it defined as the national dialogue, then you are not dialoguing. And it is not about churches should be areas where national dialogue takes place. Workplaces should be areas where this dialoguing is taking place. Business, community structure, sports organizations and things like that. Because the intention is to make sure that this becomes a sort of a movement within the country, but not an area exclusively for specific groupings or individuals to be able to engage around the South Africa we want.
And seeing that you've just made a clarion call in terms of inviting every South African to this particular dialogue, how then will this dialogue integrate civil society, academia, labor, business, faith-based organizations alongside political parties to ensure a broader buy-in? In this dialogue, there's no one side or the other side. It's not civil society against the political parties. Political parties are participants in this dialogue. So everyone has got an equal sort of standing in this dialogue. And therefore, it's not this one or that one against that one. Everyone is coming here to basically say, this is the South Africa we want, and how do we participate? And therefore, if everyone must feel they have an equal opportunity to participate in this process than like any other person who basically defines himself as a South African. And what outcomes would you consider a success for this very first sitting of the National Dialogue, despite the current political tensions?
Okay, firstly, we're not going into this convention to discuss politics. We're going into this convention to firstly establish which structures, which sectors of the community we have missed out in terms of engaging. Secondly, is how do we go to local areas on the ground? It's a bottom-up process. How do we make sure that even if we don't have to have rallies, how do we make sure that faith organizations participate, all sports organizations participate, arts and culture, heritage groupings, traditional authorities, and everything. So the intention of this first convention is to define how do we ensure that everyone participates, because the intention is to make sure all South African views are represented in this process. And therefore,
but then do you have any contingency measures as you wrap this interview? Do you have any contingency plans, to adapt to the agenda or the format of this dialogue, to keep it more meaningful despite the DA's withdrawal? Because there's always a danger of, a particular setting, a particular symposium or a dialogue and its participants not having a common agenda.
Yeah. Okay, firstly, the dialogue is not going to be a once-off sort of engagement. That's why for us, all structures must participate. The intention is to make sure that it's not about going to one venue and basically people complaining about. It's about agency. It's about how do people want to change South Africa, whether you are a church group or in a rural area, or sports, arts, and anywhere where you are, we need to start dialoguing. And the intention is that eventually we need to then have a sort of a structure that basically, this is the South Africa we want. What kind of leadership we want in order for us to reach the South Africa we want? What kind of education? What kind of business? What kind of participation by citizenry in order for them to shape the future South Africa? So the intention is not to have a one way of doing things. There are various ways of getting in touch. South Africa, it's to a very great extent, it's an organized sort of community, but those organizations and interactions take place in different forms and format. And therefore for us is to have an open approach in this whole participation and not closed approach, and define it according to what we want.
Mr. Kupe, we're out of time, unfortunately, but then thank you so much for sharing your time and your thoughts with us about this particular conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Well, that was Bongani Kupe, the coordinator of the National Dialogue Preparatory Task Team, speaking to us about the upcoming National Dialogue on the 15th of August.